Hello, everyone. Welcome to our talk, which is Moving Disability Representation Beyond It Matters. My name is Morgan Rowe. My pronouns are she, her, and I work as a lighting artist for a studio called Hi-Res.
Hello, everyone. I am Morgan Baker. I go by the pronouns she, they, and I am an accessibility lead and game designer for The Odd Gentleman.
Hi, I'm.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I thought we were going in order of the slides. So, whoops. Sorry. Okay, so I'm Cherry Thompson, and I am accessibility project manager at Ubisoft.
I'm Mary Kenny, and I was last on the slide, so that was my whoopsie doodles. My pronouns are she, her. I am an advanced writer at Insomniac Games. I was most recently on Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales.
Forgive us, you guys. It's a little confusing because we're Morgan, Mary, and Cherry.
Which we didn't do on purpose. And
we didn't. It just is how it happened.
You can blame Ian.
We also wanted to say that while we may be disabled ourselves, we're not here to speak for everyone with disabilities. We just want to chat about like the work that it takes to get, this kind of work done and how to do it in appropriate and sensitive ways. We know that language is personal and it's evolving, and the language you use to identify with and to reflect others in the community, that's also evolving. We all have different backgrounds. We're, diverse people, but there's always more work to be done in intersectionality. We're holding these conversations to empower developers from every background and part of this work, and just to like bring this conversation up and to give it more, bring it out into the light. So we hope that you will enjoy our talk. We're also going to do where I'm going to pose a question. I'll answer briefly first myself, and then we're going to raise our hands if any of our panelists have something else to add to this question. So, where did your journey in driving disability representation in the games industry start? Let's just talk about the work that we have done so far. So for me, what I really got, when I was really interested in disability representation was I was working with a friend of mine at school at DigiPen. We were on our senior project, and our main character only had one arm. And there were all these ideas that we were having at the start. We're like, oh, what if I was, it was very new. I didn't know much about, disability or like what was good to say or bad to say. And so I was like, what if, at the end, our character gets a prosthetic, like, oh, here's this cool thing that, the character is like complete. And my friend who had this disability was like, no, because I didn't understand. I was like, oh, he explains to me that it was bad because it suggests that the character is incomplete without this prosthetic, which is not at all true. People who are, amputees or have disabilities, they're complete people. They don't need anything to be, complete or finished. There's no like goal, they're already done. And so that just blew my mind. I was like, oh, there was so much I had to learn. And I think that was like my first real exposure to, disability representation and like how impactful that can be, and as an LGBTQ woman as well, I know that seeing people who are similar to me in media is a big deal. Mary.
I will hop in. So my journey began in 2019 when I started at Insomniac. And my first assignment on Miles was writing a quest line that was designed to make Miles fall in love with Harlem. He had just moved to Harlem and we wanted him to fall in love with Harlem. We wanted the player to fall in love with Harlem. And that meant creating a cast list of quest givers, and you would help them and he would fall in love with the neighborhood. And for me, what was really important immediately was capturing just the diversity of the neighborhood. And that, for writers, where we can limit ourselves a lot of the time is we start and stop with character traits, in terms of like, does this person have a temper or not? Is this person an introvert or not? And that's kind of as far as we go. We don't think about background. We don't think about abilities and disabilities. We don't think about, we don't think about religion or language or culture. We limit ourselves in that way. But diversity is so much more than that. And if we can be broader about that as we're creating our cast lists, we do create more authentic and interesting worlds constantly. But to do that work, you need to bring in the people who are experts in these areas and have these cultural backgrounds. So I had the idea of, what if one of the characters that Miles met and interacted with was someone who uses American Sign Language? So from there, it was pitching the idea to animation and pitching the idea to casting and pitching the, and just kind of getting everybody on board. And once we did that, we put out the casting call for the character's name was Haley, and we cast Natasha O'Feely, who is a deaf actress who plays her. And I can't praise Natasha enough, because her insights into how she would say things, when she would say things, which signs she would use, the unique signs that she came up with, it all just made it a really great, authentic experience. And it taught me a lot about what I want to create going forward and who needs to be in the room if we create anything. So like, that's where my journey began.
Morgan Baker.
And that was great. And thank you both for sharing. And for me, my journey began when I started really pursuing games accessibility as just more of a profession, which was back in 2017. And it's quite natural when you work in games accessibility, people will connect with you about characters who I guess traditionally would benefit from accessibility, so to speak. Though of course it's quite universal design in the regard, but people would connect with me, whether it's about things related to my own identities as someone who's deaf and has disabilities, or they would connect with me and say, I have this cool idea about a character, and they'd run it by me for like sensitivity. And I would oftentimes just connect them with someone who would serve as a better consultant. So that's kind of where it happened for me. It was kind of a natural occurrence being in the field of accessibility, people connecting with me about representation. So unfortunately, I can't talk about the cool stuff I'm doing, but you will see some announcements in the next year.
Little NDAs.
But that's my journey and where it began and where I am now.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I love how all of our journeys are really different, like all of our, like the ways we got introduced to this work or inspired to do this work is so unique, which I think isn't always the case when it comes to sensitivity and representation. And I think that really just goes to show how disability as like a subject for representation has kind of come to the party late almost, where a lot of that work is already being done for a lot of other identities and experience and people's experiences. But that was kind of where I came from, was I actually have a previous career, so I'm older than I look, but I worked in film and TV and comics and art before games. And so I did a lot of work on diversity and kind of not necessarily directly like representation. You don't really call it that, or we didn't back then. It was more kind of like a broader work towards kind of representing voices and experiences and storytelling, really. So that was kind of my previous career. And then I came to games after my disabilities progressed and I couldn't work in those industries anymore because they were extremely physical. And I actually did some work for a while with the disability rights movement, and kind of in like physical accessibility, IRL accessibility. And so when I came to games, I really started to like look up to people that were already doing this work, but for other groups. So like Tanya DePass, who runs I Need Diverse Games. Like when she started that, it started, I believe, I might be wrong. So Tanya, if you're watching this and I'm saying like giving you the wrong backstory, I'm really sorry, but this is my recollection, was that started with like really poor representation in Dragon Age of the Black community. And so like, it's really, it really showed to me that like these things were already being done in games and were already being talked about and people were already like paving the way. But it became really quickly clear to me that like there was no one visible doing it for disability at the time. So this was like quite a few years ago. And I was really surprised about that like it just kind of, well, I shouldn't have been surprised, but like it kind of been left out, like often is in a lot of these discussions. It's kind of like almost like disability was was or is still a little bit taboo, in that people are afraid to talk about it, or like don't know how to talk about it, or if they're disabled themselves and it's not necessarily like highly visible, then they won't necessarily even disclose. And so I actually, once I started getting to know people like Tanya, they started inviting me to the table to talk about like my experience with disability. And that actually like worked okay for me, just because it lent on my experience from my previous career, where I had done a lot of work with sensitivity and sensitivity reading and things like this. But at the time I was like, Morgan, like really working towards accessibility, like disability, like representation and sensitivity wasn't what I thought like needed the strongest push at the time. But there was an opportunity where I gave my first talk at GA-Conf, the second GA-Conf, and that was a passionate talk about accessibility. And I was invited to give that at Microsoft for the Disability Bootcamp, and they gave me an hour instead of 30 minutes. And I was like, there's a lot I can say in an hour, but maybe I can squeeze in 10 minutes of representation at the end, just like, by the way. And the reason I did this was like, I just finally had enough. Like, I was like, there were just a few things that happened that year where I think it was like The Last of Us Part 2, there was like a really like upsetting, like very triggering section of that. Not The Last of Us Part 2, sorry. Oh my gosh. That is on my brain because it's like literally everything anyone talks about at the moment in accessibility. So it's like the first thing, I meant Life is Strange too. Oh my gosh. I feel
Similar
like
letters.
Yeah, exactly. That was a dyslexic
of.
moment. But everyone's faces, I was like, wait, I said something wrong. Anyway, so Life is Strange 2 had like a really painful and triggering moment. And then Detroit Become Human, like the disability representation in that was like, I don't consider these things disability representation because they were almost writing tools to evoke emotions from a player, and they were negative emotions. So they're tools to like evoke, and I've seen this in the film and TV industry as well, where you use like these difficult personal situations or characters to like really make someone feel bad or like trigger a particular emotion, and it was working. But for me, it was like really intense and felt very upsetting that this was still how disability was all we ever saw in games. Is like really negative and either the villain or like untrusting or just like a pity party or, you know, things like this. So I did that, threw that into there, and then I was invited to give a full representation talk at GA-Conf, and I was like, oh gosh, I don't want to be known for this, but no one's doing it, so I guess I will. And thankfully my background in sensitivity I think gives me the research background to have been able to give that talk, and then I went on to give it at GDC. So even before I was given those talks, I was being asked like, Morgan, like, can you talk to us about this character we want to do? Or like, can you just tell us while you're working on this game, like, is there anything, like if anything pops up in terms of like our writing or our narrative, like just let us know, or our world building. And there were like a lot of conversations at places like the Coalition and things that I was having that really kind of veered towards like, oh, well, maybe we should actually be like showing that somehow in our game as well as like providing that accessibility. But after the talk, it actually, sorry, my backstory is really long. It's been a really long time.
It's very interesting. Thank you for sharing it with us.
I'm leaning in like, whoa.
It's really long. Just, I'm going to wrap up real quick. So the talk led to Megan Marie at Crystal Dynamics is like, we have some things to talk about. We're working on a game. Can you, it's super top secret. It's going to be like the biggest NDA you've ever had in your life. And it was, because it was Disney. And like, that's serious business. But yeah, so I was flown to San Francisco to work on Marvel's Avengers for accessibility, but also like, she was like, after seeing your talk, we have some things to work on. So please help us. And so it was so top secret, I couldn't even say what city I was in. It was really funny. But before that, I worked on like indie games. Card Apocalypse was a really big one, which I'll get into in a minute. But yeah, there's a lot that hasn't been released yet. And there's
Marvel is big on their NDAs. Well.
Oh my gosh, it's intense. Yeah, I think a few of us have been there.
Yeah.
Mary especially.
Yeah, a little bit.
Thank you, Cherry, so much for sharing your journey with us. It's very interesting, and I'm sure that, you know, we'll find more in our upcoming questions points to touch on it.
I was like, Cherry, can I paint off something you said, because it was really smart, and I wanted to just make sure it gets brought up in this panel. I mean, everything you said was smart, to be clear, but like, You were talking a little bit about like writing tools, and I think that that is so often kind of one of the areas where we fail in representation, because like, I mean, writers do this all the time. Like everything is a tool, right? Everything is a tool to evoke a certain emotion, or to add a twist, or to keep interest. Like everything is a tool. That makes sense. But that can't just be how we talk about this when we're creating narratives. It's not just tools to do a thing, right? We're talking about people and experiences and personalities. And I think one thing that we overlook a lot, especially in video games, the question often is, it's what is the power fantasy, right? And immediately for a lot of us, that evokes some negative emotions for various reasons I'm not going to get into, but like, what's the power fantasy? I think sometimes the better question is, who gets to have the power fantasy, and what does that mean? Who gets to be the hero, and what does it mean to be heroic? And I feel like if you can start shifting your questions to that, you are already on your way to creating this better representation that we're talking about on this panel.
Yeah, I think that's so important, is like, who is it in your audience and who is going to be playing this? Always, like, this is something I sometimes forget myself, but something I try to check in is like, act like that person's always in the room, because then that's how you're going to do your best work. I often forget that though, but
I kind of feel like those are more interesting questions too, like whose power fantasy is this versus, because we've done the same story, the same game so many times. Let's shift things up a little.
Yep.
Let's move on to our next question, which is, let's chat about, challenges that we have faced. Did we have to convince people? Were there other roadblocks? I am a lighting artist. That is my official title. And it's definitely been difficult for me, because I will approach designers and I'll be like, listen, I've got friends in the accessibility community. I noticed this one thing, like maybe there's no visual cue for this noise thing, or there's, you can't toggle this other thing, or like there's, motion, head sways making people nauseous. And I'll try and bring these things up. And they'll be like, oh yeah, we've thought about that, but we just don't have time. And again, it's not my official position. So I have to just be like, can we try and make it a higher priority? And a lot of these things kind of take a backseat, which is really frustrating. But there has been, the nice thing is that people are interested and willing. That is at least a start. And they'll be like, or sometimes they'll even be like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Like with me and my friend who, with our character who was missing an arm, people just don't think about it. And so even just mentioning these things and bringing them up means that next time they will be closer, in people's minds when they're designing something. Cherry.
Spoke for a really long time, so I feel like I should wait, but like you said something that actually made me think, and I love what you said about sometimes convincing people isn't necessarily convincing them that the work should be done or that it's something that needs to happen. Sometimes it's about convincing them that now is the right time. So I've definitely faced that in the I was in a really unique position as a freelance person before I joined Ubisoft, is that when you're freelance, you're brought in. And so you're not there to convince people necessarily, although there might be other people in the studio, the people that brought you in want you to convince, but like your main job isn't to convince people, it's to do the work. The convincing's been done, you're there to get it done. But I did, outside of the work I was invited to, experience some really difficult conversations that as a disabled person I had to were kind of like traumatizing, and I had to swallow, and I forgot them until right until you said.
Oh
but, no, I
didn't mean to trigger
really
you.
No, not at all. You didn't trigger me. Those conversations were a little bit but like I think it's really important to acknowledge and talk about. Like I've definitely had conversations where people are like, accessibility is more important than representation, and one thing at a time, now is not the time for representation, we've got to, accessibility. And the difficulty with that is representation isn't just putting characters in your game, it's making sure you're not hurting people by what you're already doing. And that was what my talk was about, because at that time it felt like I had to pull like an emergency ripcord and be like, no one's done this talk at GDC, like it went over really well at GAConf, like I've really got to get the industry to listen. It wasn't about like, please put us in your games, it was like, stop putting us in your games like this really hurts, like please, like all these tropes, you're falling into them. And like the TV industry is already learning this. The film industry is already learning this. They're already way ahead in that journey in terms of like the harms for disability. It doesn't mean it doesn't still happen, but like TV Tropes is there, like tvtropes.org is there, like it's all there. You just need to like know about it. And so there were a lot of conversations where it was just like, you know, we can't do everything for people at the same time. We have to do one thing at a time. I'm like, why not? You know, some of the people I had this conversation with, and obviously I'm not throwing anyone under the bus, but they were big studios and they were in powerful positions. And I was just like, you are the person that can do both of these things at once. Like this,
You have the resources.
Yeah, right. So like that was a really difficult and interesting roadblock that I hadn't considered.
Yeah.
Yeah, you find yourself, if not now, when? Like, what are you waiting for?
Yeah.
You know, is the big question. And I will say, so I guess I have an anecdote about this where I get it and don't agree. But like, so I'll use Haley, the character in Miles, as an example. First of all, the team was incredible. Like the animation team was like, yeah, this is going to be difficult, but dang, we're going to do it. And we're going to do it right. And we're going to get the most capture and we're going to get, you know, it's going to be great. So a ton of people, you know, no video game is made by one person, except, okay, maybe like 5 video games are made by one person, but like most are made by big teams. And, you know, the whole team like really got together and made that possible. But it did invite a new problem in that, like, okay, so we've animated all these scenes where Haley is using ASL and Miles is using ASL and they're both using ASL and life is great. And then, you know, the question became, so we had captions for all of that. So what if you don't use ASL so you can't understand? And what if you can't read captions? Now what? And so that's a new accessibility problem, right? So we had to solve that then with like recording those lines and recording voiceover narration, but that took a while to solve. So on the one hand, I get it in that solving one problem often does create another, but then you can solve those problems. Like if you put enough brains in the room and people are working together to solve it, these are problems that have solutions. You know, you just need to do it. Like, you know?
Yeah. I think there's one thing I'm going to say towards that is that like sometimes not doing them both at the same causes you problems too, right? Like if you create an accessible game and people with disabilities are playing your game and it's accessible and you have representation that hurts them, or like you have a part of your story that hurts them, or like they're not in that world and they're just completely invisible. Like sometimes it's just small things like Watch Dogs 2, which is a game I love, and I can call out because I work at Ubisoft, but like I love it. And that game spoke to me on a representation level because of the neurodiversity in the game and things like this. But like none of the streets in that San Francisco had a curb cut, and that's just not San Francisco. So it was like really disorienting, and like it can be like these little things of like, why are there steps into everywhere when that isn't San Francisco? Why is there no curb cuts? Like, why are there no disabled people in the street? Like, it can, like, representation isn't just about writing a character, right? Yeah.
It's
That's why if you,
world building. It's about feeling, like that world building.
Yeah.
And it's a team effort. I mean, that's a good point. Like, you know, I can write the heck out of a character, but if the environment art's not supporting it, and if the animation team's not supporting, I mean, you're right. It's a team-wide effort to make these better worlds and these more inclusive worlds.
That's actually something I did with Avengers that was really interesting. Was so I actually, when I was there and we were working on representation, so one of the roadblocks really quick was that sometimes you're working, I'm sure you've experienced this, Mary, where you're working with canon that already exists from a franchise that has come from elsewhere or has a long history in comics or movies or books or anything. And you're working with that canon and that story. And that canon, that story has really difficult representation that, you know, you have to honor. Like with Avengers, it was MODOK. Like that could be seen as, you know, the bad guy who's disabled and like disfigured. And so therefore you want to balance that by bringing in more disability representation. So there's like Hawkeye who's deaf, which is great. So you can bring that from the canon, but then you need to go beyond that because you want to do better. Like you want to move it forward, you want to be progressive. And so like, that was why they had me, Mocap, a character in that game, which is the game people most know me for representation. We experienced some roadblocks in terms of like production, which is like a totally different thing. Like there's actually way more that we've capped than what is in the game and things like that. So like sometimes you can't be as extensive as you want to be, and that's really important to acknowledge. But like that was kind of it. Once we decided, okay, well, we're going to have a character that uses a wheelchair, what if that world isn't accessible? So like the big focus for us was A-Day, which was the beginning of the game. And it's like this big convention for players and fans, and well, they weren't players, but comics fans and like fans of the Avengers. And so there was going to be disabled people in the crowd. Like we wanted to make sure there was like not just someone who used a wheelchair in the crowd, but like other disabilities represented in the crowd and things like this. And like, if we're going to have Hawkeye, then we need to have other characters with hearing aids visible in the game, because sometimes you have to focus on what makes a disability visible, which is unfortunate as well, right? Like sometimes you have to do that.
Well, it helps normalize things.
Right. Yeah. And it sometimes if you're not going to have that character have a backstory or speak, then they need to be visibly disabled if you're going to do that. We had an interpreter on the stage at A-Day who did ASL, which was a whole thing on like at the time. I don't know if you experienced this, Mary, because I think Miles Morales came enough later that maybe it wasn't such a barrier, but for us, we were struggling with mocap at the time wasn't detailed enough to actually do ASL very well, because of like mocapping fingers is actually really, and hands is actually a huge challenge.
It's hard to get faces.
We had to go to the people at Sony and rig up specific, like to capture each finger. Yeah, they had to add additional dots to each finger so we could capture enough data. Yeah.
Right. There's some really cool tech that's been coming out for mocap, but that's a different talk.
It's awesome though, because that was like definitely the thing. Like even when I did my mocap, like it projects like a quick human model on the person once you've done your T-pose. It couldn't do that for me because I wasn't standing. It didn't have
That's
to. It wasn't
great
the
point.
biased algorithms, you know, in our tech. And so
because you have to have a whole animation rig separate. That's
yeah,
I get excited about tech.
So there was like way more work to be done for me. So like going the extra mile to like include my character was like a big thing. But so like to finish off my thought on that was like the big thing that we did was we made sure A-Day was accessible. I went through every part of that level and I was like, here needs a ramp, here needs a ramp, here needs to be level. This bit's got like a little ledge, like your artists need to like smooth this out. Like, and then we went actually to E3 and built a replica of A-Day and the airship, and we had to make sure the booth was accessible and ADA compliant and all of that. So like it kept going, but like if you keep doing all those little steps and you're invested, then it really pays off because people were super happy.
It's important for sure. Okay. If we don't have any more things to say about this question, let's move on to our next one. So what are some of our keys to success? How did we overcome, challenges, and what learnings can we share with other developers? This is, it takes a lot of patience. Morgan's got something to say. I'll let you hit us off. I still got to mold this one over.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Actually, and this ties in because I was thinking of a challenge, but it was so like off topic that I was like, I'll just bring it up and melt it into the next thing.
It's a great time now.
The big thing that I run into is that a lot of people, especially when they're writing or like designing for a character, is the lack of just positive representation of that disability just in general. So they try to pull from old source material. Oh, there's this movie, there's this book. And then I have to be like, okay, so let's step back for a second and talk about how like that character actually is not representative of this community, especially when you look at like deaf folks and see any like sensory, blind, low vision, all these things. Wheelchair, every single wheelchair is a villain. And they're like, oh, what about this character? And it's like, okay, let's step back for a second. And so the question of what are our keys to success and how do we overcome these challenges? Nothing about us without us involve creators with disabilities, whether it's consultants, whether it's having them as writers, even if it's just a contract, or literally having them be part of the creative process, especially from the beginning during like creating the vision all the way into execution, because that's how you're going to get a character who's not only properly represented, but also more authentic. I'm deaf, so I can actually tell like if, you know, okay, Haley's good character, so this isn't Haley, but like I can tell, like I'll see sometimes like a deaf character and I'm like, okay, well they clearly, this was not written by someone who's ever actually interacted with a deaf person before. Like this is very clear to me.
Or in TV, you'll see hearing people who are playing deaf.
Yeah. Oh,
You
and
can always tell.
it's super, super like cringe because you see like they're signing and you can tell it's like, oh, but I've been practicing for like a year, and it's like, oh, I wish how simple that was.
It's the same with wheelchair users. Like when people are like this, you're like, okay, get out of that chair.
There's the handles and it's like, okay, let's back up again and try it. So like that's what I think the key to success, because people are constantly pulling from old source material, decades old, that like has not been used or written by people who have those experiences. So they're sometimes just not up to date, or two, they just are not actually good representation. And it's really hard because it's like, you know, well then how do I not, I'm sure Mary for you, because there's like some good deaf representation, but there's a lot of not good representation. There's more of that than the former. And so it's like, how do we, you know, sift through and figure out, you know, when I'm trying to look for inspiration, and the idea is, again, nothing about us without us. You just involve devs who hire devs with disabilities, baby, you know, get people involved in that creative process. And Mary, I liked when you brought up, you know, working with Natasha, and it's just like, I realized like we needed these people in the room because otherwise we're just gonna miss when we throw that dart. And
Yeah.
yeah.
I can absolutely bounce straight off that, because it is, I mean, that was speaking as a writer, you know, a lot of times I think that writers get defensive because it's always like, well, if only the writers were better. And it's like, we're doing our best, but you know, we're often the smallest team on a game. So we're doing our best we can. But as I'm going to put that caveat out there and then say that's true, but we also need to be a little less precious, because like good intentions aren't enough. And it's, I would say, for both Natasha and I can't speak well enough about Josh Castile, who was also, he was kind of our interpreter, and he did a lot of he just did a lot of education for the team. I mean, he taught us like, he told us a lot about culture.
So critical.
He specifically, one of the first things he called out was, you know, when you watch movies about people who use ASL, it's often like you have these beautiful shots that are focusing on their hands, but you can't see their faces. So like you can't actually see what they're saying, and it's ridiculous. And, you know, stuff like that we just didn't know. So I remember specifically one day on the mocap stage, Natasha was there and he was there, and they were reading through a script that I had written that was Haley and Miles flirting with each other, because of course they were. And Josh was so sweet and was just like, obviously trying not to make me mad, and was just like, so this isn't how a deaf person would say this. And I was like, dude, change it. Like,
yeah.
Change it up. I want it to be right. I don't care. My words do not matter as much as the intention. Let's get it right. And so with Josh and Natasha was able to like, let's tweak this and move this around. And then even like in terms of the way that Haley uses ASL versus the way Miles does, their fluency is different, and that is reflected in their signing. And that's not something that I can write or direct because I can't, like, you know, and it's just knowing when to be a little more hands off, like no pun intended, but like being a little more hands off there and saying like, this is what we want. This is the story intention. Go forth and conquer. Like, you're gonna make better art with it. So don't be weird about it. just like involve people in the process, and it'll be better. Like it's not that hard.
I think that's a good point of just saying, you know, one of our successes is acknowledging our weaknesses, acknowledging our deficiencies, saying, I don't know enough about this.
Yeah.
Cherry, yeah, you had something to say.
I think Morgan actually was before, but it was like a cute little thing, so I wasn't sure if it was a hand or not. So go ahead, Morgan.
Cherry, you can go ahead.
Okay, if you're sure, because I feel like I've spoken a lot.
Go ahead, Cherry. We'll go with you, and then we'll touch back to Morgan.
Okay. So there's, I think, bouncing off both, like what all of you said, like you set me up so well for this, is great. I think there's like a little bit of a caveat in terms of like, inviting people to be the people that you go to answer your questions on whether something is the right way to do it or not, is we have a tendency in the video game industry so far, and this isn't just with disability representation, this is with representation of all underrepresented and marginalized communities. And this happens a lot, not just in like when we make games, but like with Twitch and other institutes that are involved with the gaming culture, is we have a tendency to be like, okay, you on the team, you know, you are from the Black community, you are Asian, like you are, you know, disabled, you are LGBTQIA, blah, like, come tell us, you know, and that actually can be quite risky for not just that person, but also the people doing it. So I think safety is really important. And for me, like one of the big learnings is research, like, and experience, and like, that's where like involving a consultant is going to be really different to involving just someone with someone with firsthand experience that doesn't have that research or sensitivity background or things like this. Like, you need to do all of it. Like, it's not just like inviting those people to the table. It's also making sure you have specialists or people with expertise that have done the research or like know about tropes and know about writing tools and know about, you know, how this stuff is made and can give you that feedback in that way. And then at the same time, I think what Mary said about like live feedback and being flexible, like that's really important, and actually something that happens naturally in film and TV, and that is actually how film and TV is made. Like, those actors don't go on their set and do that script word for word as it's been written. They'll often, like, you know, add their own little touch, or like it doesn't have to be exact to the script for that reason. And I think, yeah, in games we're a little bit more precious, and like that definitely we need to be more flexible for sure. Cardpocalypse, I love that team so much. Little indie that I worked with a few years ago now, and honestly I was crying the whole time. I was like trying to get through it. So I was working on accessibility and also giving them feedback on their writing and their representation of their main character, who's a little wheelchair using kid and is freaking amazing. Like, what, almost swore at GA-Conf, which would not be the first, but like almost. She is just one of my favorite written disabled characters ever. But there were a couple of moments where they were like, can you really dig into this and like make sure this isn't insulting? Or like there was one point where like one of the other characters, they're trying to solve a mystery, climbed on the back of her wheelchair to reach something, and they were like, would that be insulting to that person? And I was like, it depends how close those people are, and if they've had permission before to touch her wheelchair, then like actually this would be a really cute moment to show that like they are really close and that they are best friends, and that like this is a like intimate moment. And so they're like, oh good, this is really great to hear. But at the same time, the actual things they were saying to each other didn't match, and like there was something later on that was like a little bit uncomfortable. So like the writer, who is awesome, was just like, yes, let's change it. And I'm really bad with names, and I feel so bad that I suddenly can't remember her name. I'm so
We can always look
so
that up.
sorry.
It's okay.
But yeah,
let's wrap. Morgan, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this?
I think actually that's like a pretty good like package for this entire thought. So
Cool. We've got 2 more questions and we're running a little bit short on time, so I'd like to at least touch on them. Let's move on to question number 4, which is, what's one thing that we think a non-disabled developer should know if they want to do this work but aren't sure where to start? And I think we kind of answered this in our previous question about success. Is the big thing is acknowledge what you don't know, talk to, you know, consultants and people who are professionals in this area. Yeah, Morgan. Oh, we can't hear you.
thanks. I wouldn't know.
You're good.
But I read this tweet. I want to add to this thought. And it was by Lucas Brown Eyes. He's a Native American TV. Have you seen his work? It's great. He's written for like HBO, Netflix, Disney, amazing. And recently they made something where it said like there's and this is super rough. This is not like the rule of thumb, but it's just like something good to keep in mind for developers. If you have a character with disabilities, and in this context, he was talking about Native American, but everyone was talking about, oh, wow, this is applicable to a lot of things. If you have just a character anywhere in the universe, it's good to, at the very, very least, involve one or more consultant. That makes sense. If you have a character and you're involving the community as a whole, let's say we have the deaf community, or we have whatever, the Black community, whatever it may be, you should really have some sort of writer on your team to help really accentuate that, who understands that and comes from that background. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense. And then the last one is if you have like a protagonist or like a main character or like the main character's best friend who shows up every single episode, you really should have one of like the co-creators or co-writers be of that background who understands it at its core. And of course we can have like, you know, people who can research and do all these things, but I've seen before people do research and then it's like, oh no.
Oh, no, that's the bad research.
For example, in a textbook, and then it's like, oh no. When you see what they came up with.
Well, I think it also comes.
That's not like a set stone, but I think it's a really good, just quick way to think about it. If you're looking at your characters and your universe and your world building, and you're like, how do I involve people? That's like a good way to start to think about it.
For sure. I think it refers back to what you were saying about people will do research by looking at bad examples, which is why involving real people helps a lot.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
I think
Sherry.
since I mentioned research, that actually gives me a good opportunity to explain what I meant by that, just so that people that are watching know what I particularly meant was like, I think the research part of it for me is like not what a developer should do who isn't from that background. For me, it's more like if you want to get into this work and this is your firsthand experience, then the way to bring yourself safety is to make sure you're connected to the wider community and you know like disability rights and you know the history and you know the mistakes that have been made in other industries and you are connected to all of this and you're connected to the wider community and you're not just speaking from yourself, because that's when you find safety. Is that it's not just safety in the situation in like terms of giving feedback, it's safety with the community and safety when the published work comes out and things like this. So the research for me is like people that want to be a consultant or want to, you know, do this work as a writer or things like this. But also going beyond there is like bringing in a consultant, yes, one or two, try to bring in as many as you can afford or you can find. Sometimes there aren't any, like consultants for disability representation in games is extremely rare, but like you can look outside at film and TV, and there's more and more people doing it in those areas. But you don't just do that. You also workshop with people. So instead of inviting one person from your team that has that one background, then like to get practical, what you do is you workshop with a group of people, more than like a focus group, but like an actual workshopping of like bouncing ideas back and forth. And like this is a lot of the work I've done on representation. Like I worked with the Horizon, Zero Dawn and Forbidden West teams, and some of the work we did with the narrative team was like really like workshopping that and like, okay, so let's work through what you've already got, what your intentions are, and like what the world is that you want to build. And then the last thing relating to that is my one thing for people to remember is like, you can't please everyone with a single character. You won't include everyone with one character. You won't represent everyone. It's such a disability is such a diverse community because we're literally the most intersectional community there is. We have people from every background, every culture, every race, like everything, you know, is in the disability community. And so therefore there's so many different experiences and understandings and opinions and feelings about what our disabilities mean to us that you're not going to. And there was someone on a representation panel years ago that I heard say this, so I don't want to claim these words for myself. So I don't remember who it was, but I'm just going to say the thing that she said was, if you have one character as a representation of that community or that type of person, it will by default be a stereotype because you only have one representation.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Morgan, did you have something to say?
Oh my gosh, Terry, I agree so much. I'm like sitting here, like my head is just like woo, 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 up and down. One of the coolest things I love is when I was in graduate school, I researched disability identity theory, and that was like my whole thing. And one of the cool things is that the disability identity, as well as the extensions of that, is it's one of the very few fields where it's completely holistic in its identity, because there's way too many variables. We have age, we have culture, we have ethnicity, we have race, and everything kind of comes in together to create wow, it's like we're segueing into the conversation intersectionality. Oh, I'm a natural, but it is true. Like for the disability identity, like, okay, when I talk to people and they talk about like deaf characters and all these things, I always say there's no such thing as one unique deaf experience.
Yeah.
Except in media, you would think there would be, but there is not. There is dozens of us. Dozens.
Yeah.
There's many different ways.
Lots of different opinions.
It's like in autism, we say if you've met one person who's autistic, you've met one person who's autistic. Like we're so different that we often don't get on. Like that's how different the community is. But yeah, that's the workshopping, right? Is like when you workshop, you make sure you have people with disabilities, people with all sorts of kinds of disabilities, but also from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different cultures, different races. Like you make sure you're representing intersectionality in those workshops, because that's how you get people with those voices in that space and give them a platform and give them power to talk about who they are and what it means for them and how their identities intersect. And, you know, the same with being LGBTQIA, like that really influences my experience of disability in ways that I could never cover in this topic because we're almost run out of time already. But yeah.
We're getting short on time. So I think let's, you know, if we have any final thoughts, you guys, that you'd like to share, but we are just about at the time. I want to say, you know, anything else that Morgan and Sherry, Mary, you'd like to add? Yeah, Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to add, you know, again, like I kind of hinted at this earlier, but like a lot of the spotlight is often put on writers. We need more writers. We need more writers. Yes, writers are great. I like me, but it really is, you need people who are from different backgrounds and have different experiences at all levels, because again, like when we're creating games, we're not just creating writing, right? We can't be, we're not making books. So we need environment artists and designers and creative leads and directors and game directors. Like having a diverse writing team is very important. Having a diverse game creation team is also very important, because
At all
like
levels.
as a writer, I can't see, like I don't oversee everything that goes in a video game. That would be wild. Like I get, you know,
yeah.
so
It's like
so
Jerry was saying about ramps, you know, the environment artists got to build those ramps.
yeah, so it's like, it is bringing in those consultants, bringing in different people, but it's not just one single department that needs to be thinking about this. It's every department needs to be thinking about this and then working together. Haley would not work if the other departments had not signed on. Like if we had not been able to cast the right person, if we had not been able to animate, like it, you know, it really is a team-wide effort to make it work and to make it better and to like keep building on the progress we've already made and create these more diverse and inclusive worlds. It takes everybody. Like,
yeah, 100%. Cherry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's so important because like, so I'm a game designer. So like for me, like narrative isn't even my work. Like I have been a writer in the past. I have worked with narrative. Like I have done some of that work, but it's not something that like I think I'm good at. So it's not my focus in games, but I'm a designer. Like my brain is systems, everything's a system. And so for me, like, I think it's really important for people to understand who aren't part of the narrative team or the writing team that even that is design, and it's so interwoven with games design that like you can't do one without the other. And I think that's what's unique about games in terms of representation compared to like film or TV. You're also having to think about all this giant puzzle of like, okay, but if our game design doesn't actually interact with that representation, well, it's going to feel like tokenism, or like it's going to feel like it's not really part of the like core experience and things like this. So yeah, it's like, it's such a multifaceted organizing situation. And then you also, going back to safety, need that space for people to be able to speak up if something doesn't feel right.
This is very true.
And as a backup for that, because you can't just leave it up to people with firsthand experience to be the ones to say, we're going to, you know, this is a problem. You can't rely on the fact that you think it's safe, that they will feel safe. So you need process, like you need processes in place to catch problematic language, to catch, you know, difficult topics, to like have people review things as early as possible. And so we've been doing that a lot better at Ubisoft, and we've been trying to work that into our processes. And that's how I ended up working on Immortals Phoenix Rising, to double check some things towards the end of development. There was like some things that actually got flagged in like an automated system for language. And so we had to like change like so much of the script, like literally the night before voice recording, which was like a whole thing. At the beginning of the pandemic, no less. It was like intense. But like if you have those systems in place, the earlier the better, obviously, because then you're not in that situation. But like those systems can definitely help with that. So it's not just people, you need process, and you need, you know, those business arms involved to make sure that you're not relying on people with firsthand experience.
It applies to the same idea of you want to have your accessibility baked in. You want to have your representation baked in. Like the earlier you think about it, the better. Morgan, did you have some closing thoughts for us?
My closing thoughts. I agree.
I'm kind of like that too. I'm just like, yeah.
I think I talked enough, so I'm just like, yes, preach, everyone. I agree for everything. Nothing about us without us. Have the interactive process and bake in your representative characters. And so I normally say bake in your accessibility, but now I can say bake in your representation. I love it. Yes,
it works. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
And let's make room for like more people to do this work. Like we've got to acknowledge that the reason, like we're all quite diverse on this panel, but we don't look diverse. Like we've got like multiple genders on this panel. We've got like multiple like queer experiences, so many different types of disabilities and different backgrounds and economic backgrounds. But we also have been able to do the work first because we're white, and we have to acknowledge that, right? Like we've been the first people into that space, and now we need to keep the door open. Like we need to bring people with us. We can't just be the people that are leading the way. We have to step back and let other people lead.
For sure. That is very important. We could do it'd be nice to do a whole talk and get into more of that if we could, but we've reached our time limit. Thank you guys so much for, listening. It has been a pleasure to give this talk, and thank you, Morgan, Cherry, and Mary. And I hope to talk to you all later. All right.